Welcome to Mind of a Scientist. I'm honored to introduce Randall Osterhuber, career snow scientist, avalanche forecaster, and mountain guide. Thank you so much for joining us today, Randall.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, my name is Randall. I am a partially retired snow scientist. I still am working a variety of part-time jobs, but I've been working in some level of snow science for almost 40 years now. Um, I've been working primarily in the field of snow hydrology, which also touches upon meteorology and climatology, and I've been involved in some snow physics research, a little bit of snow chemistry research, quite a bit of avalanche work, avalanche research, and avalanche forecasting. Um, and I've also been involved a lot with the kind of water supply, the stream flow forecasting part of snow hydrology here in the Sierra Nevada, as well as snow surveys, which kind of tie into that. And I've also been a lead skier for Tahoe Nordic Search and Rescue Team for about 35 years, based out of Tahoe City. So I've been involved in a lot of mountain rescues, including avalanche rescues. And almost all our rescues take place in the winter, and they all have snow, at least in the background. I live here in Tahoe Vista on the North Shore of Lake Tahoe, and I've worked a lot in the Sierra Nevada. And the Central Sierra Snow Laboratory, from which I retired about a year ago, is up on Donner Pass. It's just down the street from Sugar Bowl, if anybody's a skier and is familiar with Donner Pass. I didn't originally plan on being a snow scientist, just kind of fell into this to some degree. I did feel when I was a teenager that I wanted to study science of some flavor. Really, I was just always interested and still am interested in how stuff works. And science really attempts to answer that, whether it's the physical science or biological science. How stuff works, how the universe works, astronomy, geology, uh, biology, and certainly snow. Snow is a interesting and vexing medium. A lot to know about it, and there's still a lot we don't know about it. I started as a young man when I was going to school, looking for a friend on Donner Summit, and ran across the Central Sierra Snow Laboratory and started to talk to the crew that was working there. And they had a part-time opening for the next winter, which I was eventually hired for. And through a couple of other part-time jobs, I became a full-time researcher there. And then I kind of took over as the director of the facility about 25, 27 years ago, for which I retired December 2019. It's been a great career. It's very small field relatively. People who study snow specifically, there are a lot of peripheral fields. So if you study biology, for instance, you're certainly involved in water because no biologic activity occurs outside of the presence of water. And in California, a lot of our water originates as snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. So all those things are, of course, tied together. I've had the opportunity and pleasure to work with some really talented people and continue to do so. And I think I've stolen from all of them. I think I have learned a lot and continue to learn a lot from all the people I work with, and really appreciate everyone's energy and humor and intelligence. And when it comes to snow science, and especially like avalanche forecasting and avalanche safety, the practice never stops. The science never stops. Every year is extremely different. Every season is different. Every snowstorm is unique in a lot of characteristics, and all the snowstorms stack up to a seasonal value, and how that snow lies across the Sierra Nevada on any given year is also extremely unique. So in some sense, when we start our snow season again every fall, we're starting all over from scratch. We don't know what we're going to get and how we're going to get it. That's one thing that really keeps the job interesting and challenging, and to tell you the truth, a little vexing, because it is a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. I was talking to Milo a couple of months ago, and he was asking, any advice that I might have for for younger people, your teenagers, your high school students interested in science, kind of tips for success. And the things I thought about aren't necessarily exclusive to science, but it's really just, kind of showing up and doing the work. That's going to pay off for you in any field you enter. One thing, I've always had jobs where I kind of needed to show up on time. I felt like the people I work with demand that respect, and that's a little thing that I've seen lacking in the past few years is people take that less seriously. So I'd urge you all, whatever field you get into, is to, if you say you're going to be there at 8 o'clock, be there at 7:45 and be ready, and be involved. You want to be diligent and do the work. Uh, in any field, especially sciences and even snow science, you're going to make mistakes, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and all of us make mistakes. And those mistakes that are somewhat significant, the one thing about them is it's rare that we ever make them again, and they're all just part of the learning process. And very few people are born, geniuses in any field. It really takes a lot of trial and error and keeping at it. Um, but anyways, one thing that's really been cool about my job and my jobs is that no 2 days are ever the same. So, there's no kind of typical day. A lot of the snow environment is changes radically day to day as we get sunny weather, as we get stormy weather, as we come into a winter season, as we exit the winter season. And the weather always dictates how the snow is behaving. And when I talk about snow, when I talk about snow in the mountains, we deal with mostly, established snow packs that are on the ground permanently from typically mid-November through the end of May and sometimes later. And these can become very substantial. We're talking snow depths, the amount of snow on the ground, what we call HS, the height of snowpack, of sometimes exceeds 5 or 6 meters. And that's a lot. It's very different than kind of snow cover that comes and goes, what you might find in the Midwest or other parts of the United States. But in the mountainous West, we tend to have fairly permanent snowpacks throughout the winter season. And they can become quite complex, and there's a lot to keep track of during the big winters that build these deep snowpacks. So, our day typically starts with these basic observations on HS, how much snow is on the ground, height of snowpack, and how much snow fell overnight, and all the characteristics of that snow, its density, its water content, its depth, any other functions of precipitation. We get precipitation in the form of rain midwinter, not only snow, sometimes a combination of the two. And analyzing the winds, the speed and direction, because snow is distributed across the terrain in a highly variable fashion. Not only during snowstorms, but after snowstorms, wind can continue to be redistributed across the terrain. And the role of air temperature across the landscape. And air temperature plays some role in warming and melting snows, but really snows are primarily driven to melt and warm by direct sunlight. So that's a big factor on whether we have a clear day, a cloudy day, the time of year that it is. Obviously we get more snow, or excuse me, more sun on the snowpack in April than we would in November. And that's also dependent on latitude and slope angle and aspect, the way a slope faces. So there's a lot of factors. And part of our avalanche forecasting and avalanche safety is to get an idea of what the strengths and weaknesses are in the snowpack as they build throughout the year, and how each day's weather affects those. And that varies across all the terrain on aspect and elevation and slope angle, ground cover, whether you're in an open slope or tree cover, stuff like that. So a lot of days start with these initial analyses of the weather and how the weather has changed from the day before, and how we think that's going to affect the snow strength and maybe the melt, etc. Sometimes the days involve traveling to remote locations to check and fix on weather instrumentation, to dig into the snowpack and take measurements on what we call the snow profile, which is kind of the cross section of the snowpack, to look at the particular attributes of the snow layers, from their thickness, their density, their water content, their temperature, their hardness, um, their grain size, their grain type, and from an avalanche forecasting standpoint, we're always looking for two layers that are side by side or have an interface that are not especially well bonded, that have some weakness there. These weak interfaces or weak layers in snowpacks always precede avalanches, so we want to make predictions on those based on the existing snowpack and the weather, and then we go out in the field and dig around and do various tests. So we kind of test those initial hypotheses, which is, the basis of all science, is kind of asking a question or making a guess and then designing experiments to either prove you right or wrong, to learn about the phenomena that you're studying. And snow is very much the same way. The job is pretty cool because it has a lot of kind of adventure components to it. It's great to be in the high mountains with great visibility to look over complex terrain. Can also be very challenging during heavy storms, when visibility is reduced and we have to operate in an entirely different fashion. There's definitely some hazards out there that we certainly can't eliminate, but we learn to manage the risk. That's a big part of avalanche safety, is managing the risk. But I personally like the cold. Nobody likes to be cold, but I like to be comfortable in cold environments. I'm much more comfortable in cold environments than very hot environments. So something that I've always liked about my job. And as I said earlier, snow is a very unusual compound in that it exists right up to its melt point in a natural environment. And it has a behavior that can be very unusual. And even after all my decades as kind of a professional snow observer, I still see things that I haven't seen before. So I don't really feel anyone is an expert in this field. We're all just, continuing our investigations and our practices to learn as much as we can, whether it's about avalanche safety or avalanche forecasting or stream flow forecasting based on how much water is locked up in these big, deep snowpacks in the mountains. It could be what's the chemistry of the snowpack. It could be more broader roles of, how is our climate changing and how is that going to affect the snowpack, and how is that effect of the snowpack going to affect the rest of our environment, maybe the biological environment, et cetera. So yeah, that's in a nutshell kind of what I do and what I've been doing. So I have retired from the Central Sierra Snow Laboratory. I currently run a avalanche safety school where we teach avalanche safety to backcountry skiers and snowboarders. And I'm an avalanche forecaster for Washoe County for a couple of neighborhoods up here on the North Shore of Lake Tahoe that are threatened by snow avalanche. And I continue to work part-time as a snow surveyor in the Southern Sierra and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks. We do these long multi-day backcountry snow survey routes. And I'm still involved in kind of a part-time consulting position with the Central Sierra Snow Laboratory to get the new guys that have taken my job up to par on everything that goes on, and hopefully lend some valuable advice there. Anyways, I look forward to anyone's questions you might have about snow or snow physics or avalanches, and I'll do the best I can to address those. Some of the resources that you could look at online, et cetera. If you go to a website, avalanche.org, that's kind of the website of the American Avalanche Association, which is a bit of a parent organization for avalanche science and avalanche practitioners in the US. And there's links on that to specific avalanche forecast centers around the West, including the Sierra Avalanche Center, which is based out of Truckee, which does big region-wide avalanche hazard forecasts for kind of the Tahoe Sierra and many other avalanche forecast centers. You could link from that website as well. There's a book called The Avalanche Handbook, which is written by a couple of Canadian engineers and snow scientists. It's a very good tome, lots of great information, both historic and kind of up to date on what we know and what we don't know about snow, and how we approach snow safety from an avalanche standpoint. And a bit of a technical tome, but I think really practical is what we refer to as the SWAG, which SWAG, which stands for Snow Weather and Avalanche Observation Guidelines. And these are some guidelines of some industry standards, some best practices, so to speak, of how we measure these parameters. And there's very specific ways that we measure what might appear to be relatively simple things, but they can be complex. And these are industry standards that are shared across, really all across the world. Us in the US and the Canadians and the Europeans and South Americans all have very, very similar techniques. And we speak this common language so we can share research and observations across the snow-covered world to try to get a better handle, better understanding of snow and avalanches, et cetera. And every other year, there's a very large meeting called the International Snow Science Workshop. And it's part technical snow science meeting, part field trip, part trade show, part a lot of fun. And I certainly urge anybody to go to it, even as a high school student. I think there's stuff that you'd find valuable there. So we're meeting with technical talks and case studies and a lot of equipment reviews, and there's usually field trips from the local hosting agency and how they deal with snow issues. So if COVID permits, the next one is in October up in Fernie, British Columbia, and then it bounces back into the Western US. So something to keep an eye out for. And there's a monthly publication, or at least it's published throughout the winter, called the Avalanche Review, which is kind of the journal of the avalanche world. And the editor, the woman that puts this together, does a fantastic job, and you can tell it's a passion of hers. And it's very much kind of the same thing. It has a lot of technical articles, but also case studies and non-technical stuff and equipment reviews and problems that people are addressing at their various avalanche forecast areas and snow scientists around the world. So I would recommend looking at anything in the Avalanche Review you might find valuable.
Thank you, Randall. I think your work is such a great example of science keeping people safe, whether it's people driving to the mountains or skiers or people just playing in the snow. But could you tell us, have you personally seen the results of climate change?
Yeah, I would, in a nutshell, I would say that most of the climate change questions are relatively simple and the answers, I think, are relatively complex. The short answer is, I would say that one of the most dramatic thing we've seen up on Donner Summit is we have seen an ever increasing percentage of our winter precipitation fall as liquid, as rain versus snow. If you look historically across the precipitation record from Donner Summit, which goes back to the 1870s, by the way, because the railroad was punched through in the 1860s, there's been a full-time human presence on Donner Summit because of the railroad since the 1870s, and there's precipitation records starting in 1871. And using a lot of semi-fancy mathematical tricks, et cetera, the bottom line is the precipitation on Donner Summit really hasn't changed that much. It hasn't gotten noticeably wetter or noticeably drier, but we are seeing a greater percentage of the precipitation, which is predominantly falls in the winter up there, as rain. So that's changing as opposed to snow. So if you look at the average snow line, which is the elevation above which most of the precipitation falls as snow, and below which falls as rain, that snow line has been marching up the hill, marching up the Sierra Nevada. And that has a lot of important consequences for kind of the whole hydrologic picture for California. Since we get very little precipitation in the summer, we're really relying on the melting winter snowpacks. And if we raise the average snow line elevation, we end up covering a lot less of the terrain with snow. So we have less snow covered terrain. So we obviously have less snow delivered in the spring, the melt season. And we're also, the potential is open for our much more higher frequency of midwinter floods when we get rainstorms at high elevation that never used to do that. So that's one thing we have seen. There are similar observations from other parts of the world, but that's something that is going on as we speak.
Sophia is wondering, what kind of transportation do you use on the snow surveys?
Yeah. Some snow surveys are done via helicopter and snow machine. But I am a backcountry skier and I belong to a crew of 10 other people, and we're all backcountry skiers. And the snow surveys that we do are done in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks or wilderness lands where no machinery is allowed. We do them all on backcountry skis, and we do 4 different routes. 3 of the routes are anywhere from 2 to 3 days in length, and the longer route we do is generally around 10 to 11 days in length. We measure the snow water content in the high terrain of the Kern River watershed, which is kind of right behind Mount Whitney. If you've ever been to Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park or hiked the John Muir Trail, or been around the kind of the high passes in the Southern Sierra, that's the terrain where we do the snow surveys. And yeah, primarily by on skis.
Are you camping in the snow that entire time?
No, we're not. We have these small survey cabins about a day ski apart. Most of them were built just after World War II in the 1940s. They're typically built, log cabins of the native vegetation, and a couple of them are made of rocks. And we stock them in the fall. We stock them with mule train. Again, no motorized access. So we stock them with firewood and food and sleeping bags and fuel and a bunch of emergency equipment. So they're pretty cozy little shelters, and they have quite a history at this point. Of course, they've been around for about 75 years. And there's been snow surveys and snow surveyors and all sorts of goings on around these cabins for all that time. So yeah, I feel proud to be part of that kind of historical picture as well. And when I say they're about a day ski apart, in the spring when the weather is good and the days are long and the snow is deep and relatively hard, we could travel pretty fast. But there are days midwinter, like our crew was just out there a couple of weeks ago, where the days are very short and you're breaking trail through very heavy weather, and it can be challenging to reach the next cabin before dark. And we often show up after dark. So it can be a challenging environment. Like I said, I'm proud we're a pretty strong crew, and yeah, very adventurous job as well.
Carrie asks, what's considered a healthy amount of snowpack? And is there a point where it's considered too much and dangerous?
Yeah, great question. As far as water supply for California, I would say, except when California is actively flooding, there can't be too much snow anymore. I mean, the demands on the water resource in California is just so high. There's almost 40 million people living in the state. All the agriculture that goes on, the riparian health, that keep the creeks functioning, biologically healthy, recreation, domestic water supply. I mean, just tons of interests, and sometimes competing interests. So from that respect, there almost can't be too much snow. The problem with snow as a water source for California is it tends to melt too fast. Typically the rivers and creek, the flow peaks by early June and then starts to taper off. But that's just when we're starting our long multi-month dry season. Can there be too much snow? Yeah, well, certainly, the people that live in the Sierra Nevada, and even I would say some of the businesses like the ski areas, sometimes it's challenging to deal with all the snow removal. It could be a great stress on infrastructure, on buildings, on roads, on road surfaces. Individual households like my house here, the big winters, we really work hard to protect the infrastructure. And as far as snow being dangerous, snow can offer a lot of dangers. Certainly those deep snows, falling into deep tree wells. People have gotten into trouble falling between buildings in the snowpack, which can be very, very deep. Of course, people get involved in avalanches and all the effects of winter weather that could produce hazards. You've probably seen pictures of ski areas that have had to dig out underneath their ski lifts on these big winters. And, that to some degree might be like, wow, there's too much snow for the ski area to operate. But, skiers a lot of skiers like new snow, deep snow. So it really kind of depends who you talk to what is too much snow and what's not enough. But that's kind of my take on that.
Hmm. Stefan is asking, what was the most difficult or most intense search and rescue operation you've taken part in? And what is the overall process for finding missing people?
Yeah, there's been a lot of our rescues are pretty physically fatiguing. And I would say the most difficult for me, and I think most of the people I search with are ones that involve fatalities. It's difficult psychologically, and for all the rescuers and the rescuers' families and the victims' family. There's been a lot of kind of exciting searches. We've had a lot of close calls where we've found deeply hypothermic people deep in the backcountry and have barely got them out before they died, and they have survived. I guess those are pretty stressful in a way. Part of the process is really, typical search might look something like, somebody reports a family member missing in the early evening. They haven't showed up from skiing the day before, and they contact the local sheriffs. And the sheriffs will do an initial investigation to make sure that's in fact a valid claim. And if they think someone has gone missing in the backcountry or strayed from a ski area, they call us, they contact our search team. We now use text. And so whatever searchers can respond do, typically, 10 to 15 different backcountry searchers and maybe a couple snowmobilers. And we own 2 of our snowcats, which are over the snow vehicles, if they're appropriate. And we gather in whatever evidence we have. Sometimes those clues could be numerous and pretty good. Other times they could be sparse, and we break into the backcountry and we generally search by watershed. So we're splitting up, and we ski at least in teams of 2 for safety, and start searching the terrain and looking for tracks in the snow from whether we're looking for a snowboarder or alpine skier or snowshoer, et cetera. And we all carry, a bunch of safety equipment, and a lot of this goes on at night. So we're skiing with headlamp. So we like to become very familiar with the terrain during our training sessions. And hopefully we pick up track and track these people down. And once we find them, if they have some physical fitness left in them, we'll give them food and water and maybe snowshoes or whatever we need to keep them moving and try to hike them out. If not, we'll make camp and hopefully be able to call in a helicopter rescue. If it's heavy weather or in some conditions helicopters can't fly, we'll have to make a plan on moving them out either all the way out or to as close as we can get to one of our snow machines. Or maybe in many instances, we've had to make camp for the night or longer until we can get another transportation source out there. So that's just someone who's lost. We've also had people that are seriously injured, where it's not so much they don't know where they are, but someone breaks a leg or some other injury. And so we have these special sleds, these emergency rescue sleds that we can go back and find the person and effect the first aid, and then work on transporting them out either by pulling them, us as skiers pulling them, or moving them into our snow machine or helicopters, etc. So every search is different, and sometimes they're very challenging, but mostly they're successful, and they can be a lot of fun and very energetic and funny. A lot of the searchers that I've worked with are really exceptional people, and it's an all volunteer group, so nobody gets paid. But I would say that it has been my most important job, even though I've never made money off it. And I think most of my fellow rescuers would say the same thing.
And Carrie is asking how you interact with medical staff for the search and rescue and avalanche work. And do you administer medical care?
Yeah, we certainly do. All of us are trained in first aid, and specifically like wilderness first aid. And part of the whole wilderness first aid protocol is, if I find someone first that needs first aid, they become my patient, and they are my responsibility until I pass them on to a higher medical authority. That could be a paramedic from the fire station. A couple of our rescuers are emergency room nurses or emergency room doctors, so they're obviously a higher medical authority. But anyway, they are your responsibility until we can pass them on to a higher medical authority. Yes.
Aaliyah asks, have you ever had contact with animals while on search and rescue missions?
Yeah, we sure have. Really kind of famous search many years ago. This guy went lost, and we started tracking him and tracked him all night long. And he kept going down behind Squaw Valley Ski Area into really a vast wilderness and lower elevation. As he got lower elevation, the snow got harder and harder, and we eventually lost his track. The snow surface was very icy. It was very difficult to find his track. And this is at first light. We have been tracking and skiing all night long, tracking him. And just about 6 or 6:30 in the morning, we were a little flustered that we had lost his track, and we weren't sure what our next move was going to be. And all of a sudden, we startled this hibernating bear out of a big old busted up tree stump right in front of us, and we scared the bear. The bear certainly scared us, and we started yelling at him as he ran away. And the lost guy who we were looking for happened to hear us yelling. He was just a couple 100 meters away, and so we yelled back, and that's how we found him. I remember the lost guy was named Bruce, and so we always refer to that as the Bruce the Bear search. But yeah, occasionally we do run into animals.
Kaylee is wondering, are animals ever caught in avalanches?
They are, yeah. I don't have a lot of experience with that, but one of the guys I work with is a Sierra Nevada bighorn sheep biologist, and he's got great stories every year of what these sheep do during the winter in the Sierra. And there's several herd and that live in the high elevation of the Southern Sierra, and evidently a fair number of sheep fatalities are due to avalanches during the big years, including 2017 and 2019. So that does occur. And Todd, part of his job, the sheep that they have collared on, they have GPS collars. He goes and finds them and digs them up out of the avalanche debris and collects various organs, and they do a bunch of different research on them. But yeah, I guess that does happen. I've never experienced it myself, though. I have known people that have had their skiing with their dog, and their dog has gotten avalanched. And of course, that can be very traumatic for those of us who love our dogs. So yeah, it does occur.
Mm-hmm. Rosalie asks, you mentioned the physics of snow, and what are your favorite aspects or examples of this? I know we talked about the movie Frozen and some of the physics that went into that. Can you talk about that? I know you have a degree in physics.
Yeah, I would say that snow physics is relatively complex. We kind of know a lot of the energy forces that work on snow and the result of those, but predicting exactly where and when in the snowpack those are going to occur, I'm going to try to stay in the shade here, can be very challenging. So when we look at kind of the energy distribution through a snowpack, it varies a lot on the snowpack that lies on north-facing terrain that's in the shade versus snow that's in the sun. And one of the really vexing problems, I would say, in snow hydrology is how liquid water runs through these complex snowpacks. When we have liquid water in a snowpack, we call it free water. And when we have rainstorms or significant melt, we can make predictions on how much water might be generated by the melt, but exactly where it shows up in the snowpack is still has not been successfully modeled, and we're unable to predict that. And this is a real player with avalanches that release due to warm weather or rainstorms. And there's also kind of the grain scale physics that go on in the snowpack, which are very fascinating, to how the crystals, once they fall from the sky in a snowstorm and becomes part of the snowpack, how they change. And that's driven by really the energy profile through the snowpack, which in a sense is the temperature of the profile, the temperature of the snowpack. And so, like all physical phenomena, where we have areas that are warmer in the snowpack, they want to give off their heat to areas that are colder. So we see that energy flux go from the warm to the less warm, and that drives vapor that flows through the ice lattice, the open pore space in the ice lattice, and recrystallizes certain crystal types. And sometimes those crystals, when they recrystallize, they do not bond to each other. They bond poorly, and they can become a increasing weakness in the snowpack, which is then responsible for future avalanches. One thing that Milo referred to is I know most of you have probably seen the movie Frozen, the Disney movie Frozen, and there were several snow scientists consulted before that movie was made on what they should do and not to do. And one thing you'll notice, or maybe you haven't noticed from that movie, is that all the snow crystals that are depicted in that movie have 6 branches, and that's how snow crystals form. There's no such thing as an 8-branched snow crystal or a 5-branched snow crystal. So even though you may have gotten Christmas cards this past season that have all this various graphic design, that's a kind of physical impossibility in the snow world. And also, every ice crystal has to have a solid center. There's no such thing as a newly formed crystal with a hollow center. That's also a physical property of how they form.
Oliver is wondering, how often do people survive avalanches?
So a simple question, kind of a complex answer, but one of the biggest factors is whether you are completely or partially buried in the snow. If you are partially buried, i.e. just a hand sticking up or an elbow or part of you, your odds are way, way better of surviving than if you're totally buried. Even if you're totally buried just a few centimeters below the snow surface. If you're totally buried, statistically, your odds are 50-50 of surviving. If you're buried deep, the forces are usually really great. Typically, people cannot dig themselves out of the snow, and you become more and more difficult to find if you're completely buried, especially if you're buried deep. So the bottom line with all this avalanche safety stuff is we never, ever want to be avalanched. Even a small avalanche is pretty big compared to us. Every avalanche is unique, and people have survived some really big avalanches just by pure luck, and other people's have died in relatively small ones just instantly. So I would say the short answer to your question is that if you're partially buried, you have a pretty good chance of survival. But if you're completely, at best, I would say your odds are 50-50.
And Rachel asks, how often do people get caught in avalanches?
Well, it's a really good question too. We're not exactly sure. The culture has changed among backcountry skiers and snowboarders that if you are out skiing with your friends and you get caught in an avalanche and survive, we really ask you to report that to your local avalanche center. In the old days, people used to be very embarrassed that they were caught in an avalanche, but I think that culture is changing. If somebody dies in an avalanche, it's going to be reported. No one dies in avalanches anymore, and that will not escape the media or the knowledge of the avalanche community. But we operate under the assumption there are people out there skiing that may cause an avalanche and get caught, and they're not injured and they're not buried, and they ski away, and that never gets reported. So we only have to assume that the number of avalanches we know about is only a fraction of those that do occur, and certainly the ones that involve skiers.
Stefan is wondering, how does one become a search and rescue officer?
Yeah, it is a process of first and most important, I would say, that you're willing to do it. And once you're willing to do it, to show up, and if you need to develop any skills, like our particular rescue team has typically 3 or 4 trainings a month. And so everyone's invited, and the trainings could be about working on your ski technique, or working on navigation, or avalanche safety, or first aid, or terrain familiarization, how to do this and how to do that. So being up here in Lake Tahoe, there are a lot of very skilled backcountry people and a lot of people with significant experience, and they tend to migrate towards search and rescue. That not only do they feel comfortable operating in a winter environment, but they feel comfortable enough where they think they can help others. And like I said, if you do have particular skills that you need to work on, the team is almost in a constant state of training. So that's how it starts. And most of us have started out as hikers or cross-country skiers or kayakers or rock climbers. So we have this kind of natural affinity for the outdoors. And these are just kind of natural steps that progress from there.
Hmm. If you're out skiing on your own and you see someone doing something very dangerous, like say they're likely to set off an avalanche, how do you address that, if at all?
Well, it differs for everyone. I do not consider myself any kind of avalanche cop or backcountry cop. I am not out there to tell anybody what to do or what not to do um, on the snow. That being said, there are ways to friendly offer up, advice to people that may be doing dangerous stuff, and from more of a national soapbox, in our avalanche community, we do publish and push kind of ethics of proper backcountry behavior in a snow environment, of being courteous to other people, not skiing above other people, not skiing above neighborhoods or roads that you could threaten with snow avalanche like that. And I think that also has changed the culture, made people a little more aware that if they trigger an avalanche, it might not only affect them, but other parties. So, we try to keep it all in a positive frame and communicate. And if people, want additional education, and some people just might not know, and they're usually open to that, but there's no, violation. There's no kind of backcountry citations that are given out, just friendly advice, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So with the explosion of growth in backcountry travelers, skiers, snowshoers, you don't think that there should be more rules to keep them safe?
Well, a big reason why people go into the backcountry is because there aren't rules, but a lot of these things are common sense. Certainly, if you make rules, then you kind of fall into this thing where you have to enforce the rules. And how is that going to be done? And who's going to do that? And how do you enforce people in the backcountry? I think the better approach that all of us agree to is we just want to communicate well as a community, and offer up education and tips for people who are new to this, and make it obvious that you might not just be operating by yourself anymore, and your actions might have consequences and could affect others. So I think that's the approach that we all want to stick with.
Well said. We're getting to the end of our time, but we have a decision-making scenario, which I think you may have been in similar scenarios as the owner of a guiding company. And students are going to have to make a decision about whether to send people out into avalanche terrain. And so Carrie is asking, are there visual signs of avalanche risk?
Yes. First and foremost are other avalanches that we could see going off, either avalanches that are occurring naturally or ones that we may have been triggering. Big ones, small ones, doesn't matter. So first and foremost, avalanche activity. Second is heavy precipitation. We can make direct observations of that it snowed 2 feet in the past day. Usually avalanche hazard spikes during these big snowstorms. Another thing is wind moving snow around the terrain. And again, we can physically see this. We can see this in front of our face, or look up at the ridge crests and see the big banners of snow blowing. When the winds are strong enough to move snow, you can have substantially more snow deposited on these slopes that are lead to the wind. And fourthly is cracking of the snowpack as you ski around, these cracks that propagate from your ski tips, or collapsing sounds underneath your skis as the weight of you skiing over a weak layer deeper than the snowpack collapses. These are direct observations that there's weaknesses in the snowpack, and these precede avalanche. And the fifth one is if there's a huge spike in temperature, a rapid increase in temperature in a relatively short period of time. This can happen during rainstorms that follow snowfalls, or if we get a big snowfall late in the spring. Typically when the storms are over, the temperatures jump up a lot. Those are 5 what we call red flags and direct indications that avalanche hazard is increasing.